All right, this is Brad here, and I've invited Dr. Jeremy Barrier to join us today. Dr. Barrier is a graduate of Brighton Divinity School, and he is Associate Professor of Biblical Literature here at Heritage Christian University.
Hey,
Jeremy,
Brad.
thanks for joining us today. And
Thank you.
I got to thinking about this current pandemic, and
hmm
I also was reading a couple articles recently about earthquake activity. I think there was one maybe a week or so ago in the Pacific that was pretty intense. I think there was one in Idaho recently.
hmm
And then I just read an article, I think it was yesterday, that the upcoming hurricane season here in the Northern Hemisphere in the fall is going to be pretty intense, they think, maybe in the Gulf of Mexico in particular and the Atlantic. So, I've seen some people seem to be concerned. You've got this pandemic that is affecting all of us worldwide. You've got news reports of earthquakes. You've got talk about maybe a devastating hurricane season. And I've seen some people express some concerns that this might indicate some sort of sign or signs of the end of the world or the imminent return of Christ, that kind of thing. With your experience and knowledge about biblical literature and types of biblical literature, I just want to maybe start with just having you address that generally. Are these kind of events, are we to look at them biblically as signs of the end of the world, if you will?
Well, that's a really good question. And just to be very bluntly honest, it's a faith question if you really get down to it. It's not really a question of science, which means that it's not something you can really probe and prove one way or the other. But let's just get real blunt about it. No, I don't think we should be looking at these things as signs of the end of the world. And here's the thing about it. If I happen to be wrong, okay, then great. We're all going to experience the consequences of that. However, if we're just going to sit down and read scripture and we're trying to figure out whether or not there's a blueprint laid out for signs of the end, no, there's not. That's a misreading of the scriptures, the Christian scriptures. So that's how I deal with it in general.
That's great. I was thinking, in particular, texts like Matthew 24, and the idea of that people take away from that, like there are signs that can sort of predict the end. Could you sort of speak to specifically passages like Matthew 24, or maybe just in general the book of Revelation or apocalyptic literature? Is there a better way to read these texts than how sometimes they're being read?
Yeah, that's a good question. Part of the problem, Brad, before I jump into that text in Matthew is that we're dealing with a bigger phenomenon that we'll talk about here in just a minute, and it's called the apocalyptic worldview or apocalypticism. I know that's a 50-cent word, but we'll probably need to talk about it just a little bit. But if you look at that story that you're talking about in Matthew 24, and it kind of grows beyond that passage a little bit, you also see it. It's actually recorded in Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, and also the Gospel of Luke. It's in Mark 13 as well. And what happens is in these three gospel accounts, Jesus, after he completes his ministry in the north around the Sea of Galilee, he then moves to the south and he goes to Jerusalem. And as best we can tell, it's a very brief amount of time that Jesus spends in Jerusalem, maybe just a few weeks. We don't know exactly how long, but it's not a long period of time. But just before Jesus is arrested and before he's crucified, he's there in this story with his disciples. He's at the temple, and his disciples ask him when Jesus basically offhanded to his disciples as they're looking at the temple itself says, well, all of this is going to come down. All of it's going to come down. And his disciples ask him, when are these things going to be? When is this going to happen? And what are the signs going to be of the end? And then Jesus begins to answer them. And so what happens is people look at this passage and they start to read it, and what they're reading it for is for, quote, signs of the end. I think one of the things that we fail to put into perspective here is that from the perspective of an ancient Jew 2,000 years ago, if you were going to start talking about the destruction of the temple, well, this is the end. This is the end.
Right.
It's kind of like, and I don't mean to be rude or disrespectful, but in many ways, the bombing of Pearl Harbor was cataclysmic for a lot of Americans. The actual attacking of U.S. soil, but even more recently, 9/11, the attack on the Pentagon, and then the symbol, in New York City, these two massive symbols that fell down. That was considered very apocalyptic by a lot of people as a turning point in the history of the United States, the end of an era. And I think that's really what we're talking about here with the disciples. So when we look back at the temple, for Jesus to say that the temple is going to be destroyed was the end for them in many ways. So I guess what I'm getting at is for us to take a passage like that and to start trying to parse out when the end of the world is going to be, well, I think we're probably missing the point of the passage and the chapter. And I don't think Jesus in that context really had any intentions of speaking to us and trying to look at earthquakes and different symbols of nature or within the world that we live in to try to figure out the end of time, so to speak.
Well, that's very helpful, and I appreciate it. With the little time we have left, could you speak to just generally this idea of apocalyptic literature? I think you referenced it already.
Yeah.
And maybe for some in our audience, this terminology is new. They don't know exactly maybe what that is or what an example in the biblical text would be of this kind of literature.
Mm-hmm.
Could
Yeah,
you address
the word.
that?
Yeah, I can. Apocalyptic, or it's the same word for revelation. Some people call it the revelation of John. Some people call it the apocalypse of John. And it all kind of refers to the same idea of apocalypticism. An apocalypse is a revealing. A revealing of what? Well, to oversimplify, we're talking about a revealing of God. Revealing of God. And what would that be like? For instance, if God decided to come down to the earth today and reveal himself to us, what would that be like? Well, the way we might say it is, that'd be an apocalyptic event. And what we mean is the full scale of it would be sort of beyond what the earth can bear. For God to actually come to the earth would be a earth shattering type of event. So really, there's a way that if you really get into the subject, and you can if you're really interested, the way the Jews most often refer to it in the Old Testament and in the New Testament is as the day of the Lord. It's basically, on my birthday, that's my day, Brad. That's my
Right.
day,
Okay.
as it is for you. Well, what is the day of the Lord? Well, the day of the Lord is the day that the Lord decides to come and intervene into the affairs of humans. And of course, the assumption within Scripture is that he's intervening because so many unjust things are happening that God has to come put a stop to it. So you can take, for instance, a good place I think to look is 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, when Paul describes the day of the Lord and what it's going to be like. And Paul is actually dealing with some of these questions in both 1 Thessalonians as well as 2 Thessalonians. So this whole idea of apocalypticism has to do, what am I supposed to do if we do have this cataclysmic event where God decides to come visit? and the Jews spent a lot of time thinking about it and talking about it. And so it shows up a lot in the early Christian text.
In that kind of literature, is it typical for writers to use, a lot of symbolism to sort of, be the mechanism they use to communicate what they're trying to get across to the readers?
Yes, it is. Within Jewish literature, they love contrast. For instance, the moon turning to blood. We do have a scientific phenomenon of a red moon, and there's terminology for it, and it's very infrequent. Or an eclipse. these basically signs from nature are really, if you think about them, the Jews, the way they're talking about them, they are symbolic for these massive upheavals within the world. So when they talk about these things, they do have an idea that, for instance, God does intervene from time to time. He doesn't really give you a calling card in advance. He doesn't let you know it's going to happen. But they interpreted the overthrow of empires, in essence, as the day of the Lord. In the early Christian times, people like Paul or Jesus, they were anticipating and hoping that God would intervene. And in many ways, the death of Jesus is thought of in the Gospels as sort of this apocalyptic event where it's actually a changing over into something new, and God is restructuring the entire universe in these activities. So it's sort of like it's sort of a code word or symbolic way to think about how and when God intervenes. So what I'm getting at, this is an issue of faith, isn't it? Some people are looking at what's going on and saying God must be doing something. The only problem with that is if he is, unfortunately, I don't think any of us have been invited to the council meeting in which he discusses the details. So, of course, I think that puts a lot of fear and anxiety in people's hearts if since we don't know what God's doing. But the thing about it is all of this comes full circle to the fact that if we trust God, if we believe there is a God, and if we believe that he's capable of being in control of the cosmos, then shouldn't we also have confidence in God to be able to see us through these situations if he chose to do anything? And I think that's kind of the core issue that we're getting at. I think people today are afraid of God's intervention. The amazing thing about Jesus and some of his disciples like Paul was they were actually calling for God to intervene. They wanted to see these things because they were so excited and happy to see the king of the universe get involved. And so that's kind of a different look that they had compared to the way I think a lot of people today have, where they're actually just terrified.
Yeah, I think the idea that God intervening does bring up a lot of anxiety in people's thoughts and reactions. So with somebody dealing with anxiety during this kind of situation, as we sort of wrap up, is there anything from Scripture that you found that might be helpful for people to help them sort of manage their anxiety, if you will?
Yeah, and I'm going to pull from some of the things I see in both First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians, because they're short passages I think people could read, and I'm going to just oversimplify, okay, what's in those texts. The writing of First Thessalonians is fascinating because it is probably the earliest Christian document that has been preserved to us within Scripture, written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Thessalonica. And when he wrote that letter to this new church, they had not actually thought through all of the ramifications of being a Christian, and they didn't know what happened if some of their members died. So some of the Christians in Thessalonica, I think, were expecting God to come back so soon that they didn't think any of their members would even pass away. So when they passed away, they didn't know how to respond to it. And what's fascinating about, and let me just sort of conflate both First Thessalonians and Second Thessalonians a little bit here. Paul basically addresses, well, how are we supposed to behave and when is the end going to happen? That's kind of the questions. Paul basically says, number one, before the end comes, you'll probably see some really bad stuff, a lot of injustice. Why? Well, in order to get God off of his couch, so to speak, to come intervene, it's going to have to be really bad. That's the first thing. And then number two, what's going to happen is God would come. And then the next question is, what am I supposed to do until then? So number one, it's going to get really bad. Number two, God's not going to send you a calling card to let you know that he's coming. Number three, what am I supposed to do? Paul basically says, don't quit your day job. Now I realize with the coronavirus, we've all had to shift the way we handle things. But basically what Scripture advocates is when we live what's called a sober life, and that's the way it's oftentimes described, that means that these routines that we have day in, day out, I get up, I brush my teeth, I get a bath, I get ready, and then I work hard. I work hard through the day. Then at the end of the day, I unwind a little bit, and then I go to bed and do it again. And throughout the entire process, my Christian service to God is the way I treat other people throughout the activities of the day. Well, the very last chapter of 2 Thessalonians, Paul is basically saying, don't be idle, don't waste your time, get up and just live your life. And it's kind of like, it's not only a way to deal with coronavirus, it's not only a way to think about and deal with the end of the world, it's basically the format, the way Scripture advocates we ought to live. Live every day as if it could be your last day. Treat everybody like you would treat them on your last day. And if you have 1,000 days more, you have 10,000 days, it's all the same. Why? Because every day is an outpouring of myself to God. And that's sort of, so it's kind of, for a lot of people, it's kind of tricky. We're actually living as if it could be the apocalypse. Well, what does that mean? We're living in the presence of God is what it means. I live in the presence of God now. So if God decided to pay me a visit next week, that's fine. If not, that's fine too. But in the meantime, you know what? There's probably going to be more earthquakes. There's going to be more wars. There's going to be more epidemics. I'm just supposed to do my service to God, and He'll deal with all that. That's kind of the way I see Scripture dealing with it.
I really like that. So it sounds to me like the idea is love each other, serve each other, be good to your neighbor. And you do that whether we're in a time of pandemic and social distancing or when everything sort of returns back to normal.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that's really helpful. And I appreciate it, Jeremy. Thanks for taking some time out and spending some time with us today. And I think this will be helpful and hopefully encourage people to be curious and maybe read 1st and 2nd Thessalonians and receive some help from ancient Scripture. So thanks for spending some time with us, and stay safe out there. Okay.
All right. You too. Thanks for the time.
Take care. Bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.